Vernomatic Productions.
Are you ready?
Live from the Metal Mayhem Studios in Rochester, New York.
We are gold. We are gold.
And heard around the world by metalheads just like you. This is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Heavy metal music.
Your weekly dose of metal music, interviews, album reviews, news, and more. Want to be part of the show? Send us a message through our website, metalmayhemroc.com, or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. Search Metal Mayhem ROC.
It's getting nice and heavy.
Now, welcome our hosts, John the Vernomatic Verno, and direct from New Jersey, Metal Walt.
Good evening, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Hope everyone's staying cool. Man, it is a scorcher out there. I'm up here in Rochester, New York, and when we get to mid-90s, you know it's something crazy. Metal Walt's down in New Jersey. They're well over 100. It was so hot that he even fired up his beach house a couple weeks early this year, so he's having fun wherever you're located. I hope you're enjoying summer, staying cool, and staying safe and healthy. Well, we took a week off, but we're back. You know, we got to enjoy summer too. So we're back with a returning guest, our buddy Damian Kolodiy, filmmaker, independent filmmaker. He's back with a new project. Metal Walt, what do you got? What did Damian bring to us this time around?
He decided to take on a research project about guitarist and songwriter John Sykes. I mean, we all know John has a very lengthy history, but he's a little bit of an underappreciated musician. Damian did his due diligence, and he really went all the way back to the beginning and all the way up to his death. He did an amazing job covering all of the highs and lows of John's career and really going deep into this archival footage, these live performances, interviews with John, interviews with some of his fellow musicians, and it just put the whole package together, which I think he did a fantastic job.
Do you guys discuss the Tygers of Tang era, the late 70s, early 80s new wave of British heavy metal catalog that he was involved in?
Yeah, we start with the Tygers era, and, you know, we just follow sequentially in chronological order, because what's different about John Sykes' career is there is a storyline, and there are parallels to all of his moves that he made in his career, from Tygers to Thin Lizzy to Whitesnake to Blue Murder to a solo artist back to Thin Lizzy. It's an amazing storyline if you think about it.
And this project was conceived and went into production before John died, correct?
Yes, that's actually true. Damian took a big interest in John, and he wanted to learn more about, you know, some of the details and specifics about his career. And being a filmmaker, he, you know, rolled up his sleeves and spent months and months and months of time digging out and doing all this research and coming up with these, you know, perspectives and great archival footage.
Looking forward to this one. Great job, Walt. We invite you to get up to our website, metalmayhemroc.com. Join our community, sign up for the newsletter. Past episodes are up there. Leave a review if you like what we're doing. And stop in at our merch page. It's summertime. There's tons of stuff up there. Tumblers that mix up your cocktails at these concerts, shirts to wear at the concerts, and just other fun stuff. All right, from my co-host, Metal Walt, I'm the Vernomatic, and we are Metal Mayhem ROC.
So today we welcome back to the show filmmaker Damian Kolodiy, who we last spoke to about his awesome series about the New York City hard rock band Riot. But today he joins us to talk about his new project, John Sykes, his words, his music. Damian, what's up? Good to have you back.
Good to see you again, Walt. We've been keeping in touch, and I'm glad to be able to come back with you with another project, like, relatively quickly. You know, like it wasn't really like long in the works, but yeah, I think it's going to be a good one, man. I think it's going to be something really cool.
So, I mean, just tell me off the bat, like, what inspired you to want to take John on? Because you started this before he passed. So what drove you to take this on as a project?
I only really found out about John Sykes probably a couple of years ago. Similar to Riot, where, you know, just going online and finding out, like, oh, there's this controversy with Whitesnake album, and, you know, like, finding some videos online and then finding out, oh wait, John Sykes, like, oh, Blue Murder. I remember that band because I had a Blue Murder album, the second one, which is the only thing I had of his at the time. And I didn't really connect the dots until recently, you know, and I knew of Tygers of Tang from their more recent like songs. And then I'm like, oh, John Sykes played in that too, and Thin Lizzy. And I'm like, who is this guy? Like, what's going on? Like, why don't I know him? This is really fascinating. And so like, I just started digging in and buying those albums. Like, I bought the Thunder and Lightning Thin Lizzy album. A friend of mine who actually turned me on to Riot, he's older than me. So, I started getting into metal maybe around like 91 or so. So I missed like that whole 80s thing, but he's like, oh, what about that first Blue Murder album? I'm like, there was a first one? Like, I had that one, and I bought it because We All Fall Down, because I love that song. I heard it on WSOU at the time, but then I was disappointed by the album because there was sort of like all these slow and mid-tempo songs, and I it wasn't what I expected. I expected more like We All Fall Down. And so I just sort of like put it away for a while. And then I'm like, oh, there's this other album and there's this whole with a different lineup. And, so I came into like the John Sykes story from like probably a very different place than most people, but it's like discovering everything all at once made it really exciting because it was like, holy cow, this guy did all this cool stuff. What a great story. And like, I never heard of him again. Similar feeling as to the Riot thing. Like, why, what's going on? Like,
there's always been a bit of a mystique about this guy. Was there something about his story that drew you to want to do this? Because, maybe you were saying, hey, I just discovered this awesome artist that's a great musician and he's done so many things, but was it sort of some of these controversies? Was it a little bit of everything?
I'd say a little bit of everything. I mean, when I first saw that Billy video on the Weird Al show, and I was like, holy cow, this guy, like, I mean, he's just a fucking rock star, and like, he just looks great, sounds great. He tears it up on guitar. Like, this guy clearly should be more well known, like he should have been someone, that would have been on my radar. Like, why isn't he? And then, like looking at his, like, okay, like he's sort of reclusive. He's got this new album that, I'm reading comments. People have been like, oh, it's been in the works for a long time. And like, what's going on? He's just kind of, it's not coming out. Like no one's hearing anything from him. No one knows where he is. And that was one reason I didn't really like pursued making a film project. Cause I got sort of hooked by his story, but he was just like off the radar. And I'm like, how can I even like reach out to this guy? He's just, not really out there, in the digital world, in the online world, or putting himself out there. He's almost sort of like a recluse, So I just sort of put that idea on the back burner, I would say, as much as I was interested. And I started buying those albums to listen to the music and getting into his music and being like, oh yeah, like this is the kind of stuff that resonates with me, like the melodic hard rock metal stuff, the sort of shredder stuff. And it was just everything, like it was like a mystery also to like what happened. Like there was this mystery element to his story and what's going on, what happened to him and what's going on. Like, and he's got these hardcore fans again, like these people who are like, John, come back out there. Like, we miss you. We need you. I mean, you see these comments from people who just like really like love this guy.
Going into the film itself, how did you approach this? Like, talk about the setup. Like, what's the layout of the documentary? How did you approach it?
It wasn't until he passed away that I started seeing a lot of these tribute videos coming out on him. And that was a mix of like people like doing podcast kind of stuff where it's mostly talking heads. But then there was also, like telling John's story. And after seeing a bunch of these sort of videos, like the information was good. There was like interesting, useful, relevant information. But it was presented in a way where you always had, and I believe it was all done using AI, like most of these, where it seemed like there was probably they generated a script, like give me the story of John Sykes. And then I think some of them read that script by them, either they had a narrator or they had an AI voice read it. And then there'd be like recycled imagery. There's a lot of videos of John Sykes playing with these in Thin Lizzy or Whitesnake and Blue Murder. And so there'd be like this recycled imagery, sort of you'd see the same shots, but it wouldn't sync up with the script. So, they'd be talking about John and Whitesnake and Coverdale, and they'd have him playing with Phil and Thin Lizzy on screen. So it was like asynchronous. I'm like, there's even videos where there's a John Sykes in the Music Hall of Fame, in the Rock and Roll Music Hall of Fame. He's like one of the CEOs or something. And sometimes his image would pop in there. And I'm like, okay, this is definitely like some AI, like randomly like assembling these videos. And I just started seeing a lot of that. And it's, like, on the one hand, it's kind of, interesting and good. But the other hand, I'm like, he really deserves like a proper presentation. And in all these videos, you have someone else saying, and John said in this interview, and, David Coverdale said in this interview. And so you're not hearing it from them. You're just hearing someone reading what they said somewhere else. Mm-hmm. So, and you don't hear any music, because if the music is, YouTube recognized the music, and if you have the music in there, you can't monetize the videos. So all these videos are intended to just really like be clickbait to be monetized, right? Mm-hmm. So you don't hear, they just have some like, like random track sample, rock track, playing in the background. You don't actually hear like the music that you're talking about and celebrating here.
Yeah.
So I was just kind of like, I want to do something where you hear John's voice and you hear his music. I'm not going to monetize this, so I can actually do this to give him a proper presentation. So that's why I called it John Sykes, His Words, His Music, because we get to hear him speaking a lot throughout the project. So I, scoured around for the few interviews that exist of him, and the music. And as you know, because you've seen a preview copy, I like to have lengthier than average performances of different eras of his time, where you really sort of like, it's also like a concert film as well, which is what I did with the Riot. But like, you really like get to deep dive into the performance aspect of it too, and into the songs if you want to. So that was the idea. And then I didn't know how long it would be or what it would turn into, but I just started finding things online, and clipping them and figuring out how can I arrange this in a coherent way, in a chronological way, in a coherent way, in an engaging way, and make it feel like a real documentary, and like you're hearing from John and you're hearing from people who were there maybe or who knew John, and it feels like a real documentary, not an AI video, and something that would really like present his legacy, and why he's important to so many people, and shine a light on it. And there was a lot to discover for me in that process.
How did you go about the research? Like, maybe the questions are, how far back or how long ago did you start this project, and like, where do you go to get this footage or the musical videos or the interviews or the recording?
Mostly YouTube. There's a lot of stuff on YouTube, but it's not always so easy to find. Like, some stuff exists buried within other stuff, or like if you do a search for John Sykes, you're not necessarily going to find everything, everything. Like, sometimes you have to dig around. And one of the better resources was looking at John Sykes' Facebook group. There's a Blue Murder and John Sykes Facebook group. There's a page called John Sykes Guitar Wizard, and like finding stuff like that metal show when John Sykes was on that metal show with Eddie Trunk. Like, that's not on YouTube. I found that on Facebook, like digging through these groups. So it's sort of like you really have to like get in there and look around a bit and try to find these bits and pieces, that are out, scattered around in the digital, atmosphere, and then try to arrange them in some sort of like order. And I did that with, there's live footage videos of Thin Lizzy that I used, that I recut editing some other B-roll from other performances and mixing things up a lot also to try to make it more dynamic or create a point that I wanted to see. So I'm taking like stuff that already exists, but I'm adding new visuals to it or taking audio and moving it around. So there's some stuff, like a couple sound bites I took from the Slide It In documentary. And there's an interview with John there and a couple other guys talking. And there's Thin Lizzy story documentary. So taking bits from that, acknowledging it in the film, like excerpt used here, and maybe putting some new visuals on it and combining it all together with other stuff like Eddie Trunk did a tribute after John passed. And I contacted him and got permission from him to use, the audio from that. And so that's interspersed in. And there's some other people who, do metal shows and also did some tributes to John. So I contacted them and got permission to use, little bits of there. So it's a mix of like archival footage of John, of him performing, mixed in with some more recent stuff since he passed, of people sort of memorializing him. And I guess after he passed, there was this buildup in interest and I had this feeling like, man, I really wanted to do this. Now he's gone. Like, is it still possible? I'm like, let me give it a shot. Let me see what I can put together.
So did you set it out to be a chronological, like, was that your vision? You said, hey, I'm going to follow the chronology from, the start of his career in the early 80s with, Tygers all the way through the Lost solo album? Or maybe did you change your perspective or your approach based on the findings of the research?
Yeah, I mean, I figured like it should be chronological, but I didn't know how thorough it would get. Like I wasn't really familiar with these solo albums at all until I started digging into that. So I'm like, oh man, like he put out 5 solo albums in the 90s, like, and most people have never heard them because they were only available in Japan on CD. So, I actually bought almost all of them since then. And then, there's like Street Fighter was his first band. And there's a group, new wave of British heavy metal Soundhouse, and someone posted pics from that time. So I'm like, oh yeah, like I can maybe use some of those pics and grab a little of that song to show like where he really started. And there's not a lot of footage with him with Tygers, but he did that one video, Love Potion number 9, where, like I can use that visual of him like soloing. And then there's Marty Friedman talking about him on playing in Tygers and how he influenced them back then. And there's like 2 videos from British TV. So I'm like, oh, there's just enough there where I can include. I didn't know if it would work, but I found there was just enough material there to sort of like cover the lifespan of his career, pretty much. But I didn't know until you really dig in,
I could understand that too, and I do think like the chronology of his career is really important to tell the story, right? You think of, your film starts with Tygers of Japan, Tang. He was joined them in 1980, in time for their Spellbound album. He also contributed to Crazy Nights, and maybe this was his first exposure to that new wave of British heavy metal scene. But that seemed to be a very quick in and out before he joined Thin Lizzy. And so, Damian, in your research, what do you think he brought to the table to the Tygers group, and why was it just like such a short-lived tenure?
Well, he did 2 albums with them.
Yeah.
And he's still on a couple tracks on the 3rd album, as far as I understand. I mean, he was he just kind of like, he had a pretty quick trajectory. And from what I understand, I mean, there's not a lot of interviews of John talking about his time in Tygers of Pantang. So, like I wasn't there around at that time, like listening to Tygers of Pantang. Yeah. But I think there were some artistic differences with him and the singer, John Deverell, I think, at the time, and the rest of the band. Because I think John Deverell also left after Crazy Nights. So there was some artistic difference. John, from what I understand, was a very driven guy, You know, like he really wanted to like be focused and had high expectations. So maybe the way the band was organizing their future plans or whatever, you know, wasn't jiving, or there were some artistic differences. You know, the Crazy Nights album is a little bit different from the Spellbound album, like you know, but it's hard for me to like pinpoint like, oh, this is why he left. But you know, there was something within the band that wasn't jiving, and he had they were on MCA Records, and he had in his contract he had to do a single still after he had decided to leave, and the producer Chris Tangarides, who had produced their album, also worked with Phil Lynott from Thin Lizzy, and he's like, hey, like I still got to do this single. I got this idea, but it'd be great to get Phil involved. And can you reach out to him and see if he'd be interested? And Phil was, and they met and they worked on this single and they hit it off. So soon after that, like he was sort of invited into the band.
Yeah, that was a special time for Thin Lizzy because, you know, and you see it evident in your film, the bond and the appreciation that Phil and John had for each other, right? You can see they were genuinely collaborators and friends. But, you know, he joined it, you know, for their last studio album, per se, Thunder and Lightning, but it brought more of a harder edge to it, right? It was like a more modern metal sound to it. I mean, think of songs like Cold Sweat and the title track of sorts. But, you know, it's in a sense, it was a bit of a shame because he got in there and then basically the band ended, but it didn't necessarily end his relationship with Phil, right? But I mean, from your perspective and your research, do you think he helped rejuvenate that band sound maybe for a new generation?
Oh, absolutely. Like he and John's, I think I said it himself, like he lit a fire, you know, under Thin Lizzy and you know, as an artist myself, you know, like when you have this collaboration and you just jive with someone, it gives you new energy, you know? So I'm sure Phil was like, oh yeah, like, let's go, you know, let's go with this sort of new direction with this harder, faster version of songs and that John was bringing. You know, he's a young guy, sort of a hotshot guitarist. And I think he, like gave them an edge that they didn't have and motivation that they didn't have. You know, it was like a fresh jolt of adrenaline, I guess, put it in there. And I think that you know, at that time, from what I've researched, is that they had sort of publicly announced that this would be their last album and then they'd be breaking up. And I think Phil had second thoughts about that after John really came into the picture and they started like going on tour and playing. But because they had announced it, like they sort of felt obligated to go through with it, even though like, I guess there wasn't, you know, that maybe their feelings, Phil's feelings about that had changed. But like, I understand that like, you know, at that time, once you sort of make that, it wasn't like now where they're like, oh, we're doing our final tour and that lasts for 10 years, you know, like back then it was like they announced it publicly and they held to it because John stuck with Phil after Thin Lizzy disbanded. Right. The Phil Lynott and the Three Musketeers traveling around. Then he did Grand Slam and some other projects like, and John was playing with Phil like every step of the way after that, you know? And so it's like, it sort of like just kept going. I mean, there's a bit there's an interview with Phil in the film where he's like, well, we wanted to get John on the radar and then launch him to, you know, out, you know, that's why we're going back on tour, which I thought was kind of cool. You know, I thought it was a nice, like, you know, sort of prediction, you know, and a Phil's part, like recognizing, you know, like that there's something special with this guitarist here. Like,
hey, I mean, John moved on eventually into the Whitesnake camp, but maybe, Damian, comment on when Phil did pass away. I know it shook the rock world. It was obviously a devastating blow to John. I mean, you know, in some of the interviews and things you see, he almost looks a little shocked, like in a little bit of disbelief.
I'll say from my research that John didn't really want to go to Whitesnake. He wasn't a big Whitesnake fan. of the music. He rejected their first offers. And then Phil was like, hey, dude, no, like, this is where you need to go. We're just doing our thing here, but like, this is the next step for you. Ask for more money, get the money, get in there and like, fly. So Phil sort of convinced him to do that. I think John in his heart wanted to stick it out with Phil, but it was just like, the deal was just too good. And, there was a lot of pros to like what was on the table for him at that time. So John and Phil maintained a relationship, they stayed at each other's house and, they still maintained their friendship and hung out whenever they could. In some of the documentaries I've seen, I mean, Phil towards the end was really drugged out, and in rough shape. And John mentions that a little bit, that they'd been in communication and talked about it, but like Phil was just like a stubborn dude. And, there wasn't much convincing him that he was as sick as he was at that time. So that losing him, like his, like, I want to say brother, like musical soulmate in a way, this guy who was his mentor, really, like Phil was his mentor. I mean, that early, it's devastating. And I think John carried that loss with him throughout the rest of his life, like, as you can see, like it when he reunited Thin Lizzy in the 90s and into 2000s, I mean, it wasn't to try to cash out or something because he didn't need the money. He had, money from the work he did in Whitesnake. It was really to honor Phil and honor his legacy and play those songs. And, I think feel spiritually closer to Phil more than any sort of, financial reasons or anything like that. I don't think they made a lot of money.
I mean, that was going out of the timeline order. I mean, for the better part of a decade, that reboot of Thin Lizzy of sorts was back out on the road. I mean, they put the live album out, and I remember when they first booked those U.S. tours, I couldn't wait for it because on one hand, I had never seen Thin Lizzy, right? So it was an occasion to hear these 15 great songs, and it was also an occasion to see John out there after 10 plus years or more to say, wow, I haven't seen him since Blue Murder. Happy to see him and hear that guitar tone and his voice. But you know what? From what I understood is John was the catalyst to bring Thin Lizzy out on the road. This wasn't even Scott Bourne. This was John's idea as sort of a tribute to his friend. Was that correct?
Well, according to interview with Mark Mendoza that's in the film, that it was one of the Japanese promoters they were working with in Japan, because John and Blue Murder was still popular in Japan in the 90s, much like Riot was. That was like the market he focused on, where he was really appreciated. And it was one of the Japanese promoters was like, hey, there's this anniversary coming up of Phil's passing, I think 10-year anniversary. And you still in touch with, the other Thin Lizzy guys. Maybe we could do some shows over here in Japan, and remember Phil and celebrate him. And that's initially where it happened. They first did it in Japan. And then people were like, oh, hey, why don't you guys come play over here? So it sort of really happened organically. It wasn't John's idea, but he was the one that was pitched the idea because he was the one active in Japan, with Blue Murder at the time. And he's the one that sort of like tried to reach out and organize it.
Yeah. And I think he was the catalyst as to why, to a sense, even the legacy of Thin Lizzy has carried on even after his part in the band. He ended that, I can't remember what year it was, but, after John left, or let's say, removed himself from the unit, Scott Gorham kept the unit alive. He ended up bringing in Ricky Warwick, the Irish singer. There were lineup changes, but some of the guys stayed in there, which had then eventually turned into the Black Star Riders, a whole nother band, which still exists to this day. So it continued on.
Yeah, and I think Brian Downey plays now with another version that plays Thin Lizzy songs, where he's the only real Thin Lizzy guy, but he's got great musicians and singer who sounds just like him. And and he's doing, I saw them 2 years ago.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
Damian, heading back to, let's say, maybe the pinnacle or the era of Whitesnake for John, right? This is the one, such big commercial success, yet so many misses for John personally, and so much controversy around what happened during this tenure here. So again, like you mentioned earlier, he maybe had been reluctant to join initially, and he was kind of pushed in, but he joined in during Slide It In. He didn't necessarily write those songs, but he was in the band around 1984. But when it came time in 87, which would eventually have become the self-titled Whitesnake album in 1987, I mean, this one, we all know it, right? It was one of the biggest selling albums of all time from that era. It's just front to back hits, Still of the Night, Is This Love, Give Me All Your Lovin'. I mean, on and on and on. But what kind of to the average fan is a little bit disappointing is you may not know this as John's material, because if you watch Headbangers Ball and MTV, you saw Adrian Vandenberg in the videos. You didn't see John Sykes because John was gone from the band by then. So he never got the credit really for people listening to the music to say, oh my God, that fucking guitar is John Sykes. It's not Adrian Vandenberg.
Yeah, that's a scar I think he also carried with him throughout the rest of his life, that played a role psychologically for him, like distrusting the music industry in general, being distrusting of people, and wanting to maintain control of things. I think it's an experience where he really got burned. I mean, he made money from it because he kept his writing rights. He's credited for most of the songs on that record, along with Coverdale. They wrote them together. I found some interviews, Coverdale talking about that creative process of how they went away. It took several years, and there was issues with Coverdale's voice.
Mm-hmm.
You can watch the film to get more into the details. I don't know if here is the place to dissect like who said what and what happened, but it took them several years and to finish recording that album. And Coverdale had issues with his voice. He had to have surgery. John wanted to keep the things going. I'm sure there was a clash of like, how do we keep moving forward in this situation? And you get to hear a little bit of from both John and Coverdale in the film. I tried to like show each's perspective on that situation. Without like, I mean, no one's like, here's the magic answer to like, why, but it was a clash of personalities, and this, maybe if the situation had been different, that wouldn't have happened. But like that's the way it played out. John didn't get the credit that he deserved, and he didn't get the recognition he deserved. I had no idea about any of this, and he wasn't even like pictured in the albums. I believe like there were no pictures of the. So no one knew about it. I mean, unless you were like a real, music guy who dug into this kind of stuff. But like, yeah, he got fucked over, and that scarred him, and he didn't get the trajectory that he was deserved for like being part of this album that like went on the American, as part of the American cultural landscape at this point in time, and that. That hurts, man. I mean, that's brutal. That's a brutal psychological blow. And since then, the grunge thing happened, and he just had diminishing returns on his art, and that takes a toll. Like to me, that explains like why he became less and less productive. In the 90s, he still had that fire. Blue Murder, okay, did these solo albums. But then, in the early 2000s, I think he, metal was still out, like, and he just was getting less and less. You want to keep doing something, you want to see a trajectory, right? Like the line goes up. And like for him, I think it wasn't. It was like a flat line or diminishing returns. And it takes it's like as an artist to get back on the horse and do it again and have that drive and motivation. It gets harder and harder as you if that's the situation you're in. So I think that's part of the reason his productivity tapered off as he got older.
Yeah, and I think to me, I was 18 in 1988, and Blue Murder, that was around the band was formed. Now, I don't think I remembered this drama with the Whitesnake stuff around then, but all I remember is, hearing about this trio of sorts, right? Carmine Appice, who everybody knew, he was like the old-time drummer from the 70s, and then there was this bass player, Tony Franklin, had a funky sound to him because you used to hear him in the Firm videos back in the mid-'80s. And then you hear John come out, and you're seeing the Valley of the Kings video, and then Jelly Roll comes as the follow-up single, which I guess you could call it a ballad, but I wouldn't necessarily say it was like a love song. It just was. It had a lot of harmonies and melodies. It was a little slower, but it was also had a little bit of a twang to it too. But I was engaged. I was all in the Blue Murder camp. I'm like, I got the cassette. The album was awesome. I remember they toured the opening slot on the Billy Squier King's X tour in the autumn of 1989. It was the only time I ever saw them. They had a 35-minute slot at the Ritz. But you know what? They're sort of an underappreciated band, and I guess you could say within the musicians camp, they have a big place, right? But it's not something commercially that a fan's going to go out there and search out Blue Murder when they think of 80s hair metal. And that's a shame. But to your point, Damian, I think this was maybe his last shot at going for it the big way. And when that didn't turn the corner for him, you're in the early 90s now. The record label didn't support him. He puts out Nothing But Trouble. Now he's got a different band behind him. Marco Mendoza's sort of his sidekick. And I think it seemed like he just focused on his core audiences outside of the U.S., and Japan was a big one.
Yeah, I mean, he took, there was 4 years between the albums, the Blue Murder albums. And I think, the disappointing results from the first one, then he had kids in that time. And, you being a father and I being father, when you have like newborns, that's also requires a lot of attention. And so, and he built a studio in his home. So like all those things, like no one anticipated that like the music landscape is going to drastically change because the grunge movement is coming on, so that wasn't something anyone could have predicted at that time. And 93, by the time that second Blue Murder album came out, and yeah, Carmine and Tony had it'd taken so long that they'd sort of moved on to other projects by that point.
Yep.
So he had to scramble because I think he still had a contract with Geffen to do another album, which is why they released an album with Blue Murder in 93. And then, yeah, he did a tour in the U.S. They toured with Bon Jovi at that time. Oh, no, that Bon Jovi tour was before the second album. Yeah. But, they just didn't get the traction in the U.S. They toured with the second album. Yeah. And I don't know. I guess, people had moved on. The MTV was showing all the grunge, and Japan was still the place where like the grunge didn't overtake, like nobody stopped caring. I don't think they were like that hair metal, the term hair metal became such a fashion thing here, and like a trend, a fad that came and went, where in Europe and Japan, that wasn't such a big fashion trend.
Right.
It wasn't known as hair metal. It was just, rock. And that never really went away. So there he was still appreciated and, treated like he should have been treated, like the rock star that he was, so he focused his solo album and he says it in an interview. The name Blue Murder wasn't doing anything in the States. It just was, no one knew what he was talking about. So he changed it to Sykes with his solo stuff. He went and changed the name to Sykes, and I signed with Mercury in Japan, and they just released the albums there, and he would tour there.
Yeah, and that's in a sense. Again, this leads to again that mystique about him, but also his long legacy, because he, in a sense, maybe to the average fan, once Blue Murder was done, until he came back on the Thin Lizzy tours, you kind of side of you said, John's probably out there, but nobody's really keeping an eye on him. But here it is 20 something years later, people are still wondering what happened, trying to piece that puzzle together, saying, why were there only sporadic public appearances, and why was he such a perfectionist that he couldn't drop that last album? Why was he scrapping projects? Why did he go on the Eddie Trunk show in front of Mike Portnoy and announce a new band that never happened? He was, in a sense, as a term is said, he was a lost giant of rock and roll.
Yeah, well, I think in the 90s he was still putting out stuff. He was producing, he was touring, he was writing. So that for like that period, he was still quite productive. But like I said, I think he was just getting diminishing returns. His albums weren't available in the US. Like, I don't know if he, I know there's a great show from 95 that he did in LA playing from stuff from his first solo album, but I've not seen any other video of any American shows after that. It's always in Japan.
Yes.
And then, then getting into the 2010s and, the collaboration with Mike Portnoy, that didn't work out. Marco Mendoza explains it, that John didn't always have the right people working together with him, like on the management and the business side. People came and went, and maybe they weren't doing the best job. And John had high expectations, and he wanted things, like you said, a bit of a perfectionist. So instead of just like going out there and being like, all right, let's just do this and see what happens, I think he overthought about what he needs to do to do it better this time because of the past experiences. So it was sort of like this, I don't know, like a snowball effect of doubt, maybe psychological doubt. And it became harder and harder for him to really just go out and rock and roll, just go out and do it.
Yes.
And like he did when he was more of a carefree youth, just driven and ready to put himself into any situation. He just became very reclusive, and he didn't like the business aspect of it. It
was interesting that the sort of the last piece of music that he left with us was in the early 2020s when he announced he was signing with Golden Robot Records. And, he dropped a couple of songs which were good, Dawning of a Brand New Day and Out Alive. They came out in 2021. And then there's some footage where you have some interview with him or a perspective where he said, okay, he ran into some roadblock with his record label, and he wasn't sure what was going to happen with the material. And of course, you never heard anything about it again. And then late last year, I think it was December 2024, out of nowhere, we get a message through all the heavy metal news outlets that he had passed away of cancer at the age 65.
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing, he probably had been diagnosed in the last couple of years, and that explains why everything was put on hold. As far as, they wanted to release the album on his own, under his own control, on his own label. I think he had released Bad Boy Live on his own label. That was the live album in 2004.
Yep.
Which was his last sort of album, really.
Yep.
And probably, he was just, thinking, I got to deal with this. I got to beat it, and then I'll get back to the album. I mean, you put yourself in that situation. I don't know if you think okay, I only have whatever, 9 months, a year left. You're like, no, I'm going to get through this and then get back to my life. Right. But that's not the way things played out. That's my guess. This is not coming any sort of, but that's my feeling just based on, being involved and putting together this project, that sidelined that album, because the album's been recorded.
Yep.
All those tracks have been recorded a long time ago. So it wasn't a matter of finishing the songs or anything like that. It was just putting it out there, finding the way to put it out there. And, maybe it still will come out. I think his family probably would want to honor his legacy and put it out. I mean, that's my feelings that, John would still want it to come out. And that was the other thing he sort of garnered, that he didn't really understand like how people had maybe valued and cherished him, the amount of people that did. And I think a lot of new people discovered him, in the last years, thanks to the internet, like just like I did.
Right.
And he never had an idea of, because he wasn't online, he wasn't an online guy. He didn't run his Facebook, he didn't run his social media. I mean, he was just like an off the grid analog dude, like Eddie Trunk tells this story when he was listening to those demos, like John brought a Discman, like in the car, and like played it for him from a Discman, and like,
Yeah.
like he was just like an old school, like sort of analog dude. So he didn't know like that. There's people out, like if he had done a new tour, like it would have been the biggest tour probably that he's done, in 20 years or something like that. Like people would have come in numbers. I mean,
absolutely.
That's the tragedy of the whole situation. And I don't know, man. I'm just like, at least I can try to add something to preserve his legacy and help people discover them. I mean, the film is not, it's not really made for people who have a short attention span, who are just sort of like, all right, let me check this out, like between videos or between them, like on my lunch break. It's a deep dive. It's definitely like a research project, and it's for people who really want to like dig in, like what happened in this guy's career, what kind of music he put out, and what was his feeling. And you sort of, it's the story of John is like, his productivity. I feel like, he had this awesome experience with Phil of like, he experienced this like beauty, of creation together with this person who's like your brother, and that drives you and motivates you. And then he had this experience with Coverdale, which was the opposite. And those two paradigms like, weighed on his shoulders throughout his career and affected his productivity and his mindset and everything that happened since. So it's kind of like this battle between these two core experiences in his early career in the 80s that defined the rest of his life. I mean, that's what I see, like, the thread throughout the film.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Damian, the film is fantastic. You've been kind enough to allow me to preview both episodes 1 and 2 for the listeners out there. You have to invest your time in it, but you will learn a lot. I certainly did, and I thought I knew the story. But, what's great about these films, though, it's a perfect combination of, interviews with John, interviews with his peers, his colleagues, others, great archival footage, great performance videos, and concert videos. Lots of good images coming through it. Damian, you do a really good job with your stuff, and I wish you the best with this. So talk about the release dates and where the listeners can find these episodes and when they're going to premiere.
So I'm going to release, there's going to be like an online release because I wanted to have something of a possible shared experience, which just means that we can be in a chat room together while the first premiere. So it's sort of like a low tech shared experience. Obviously seeing it in a theater would be the ideal situation, but this is a not-for-profit film. I'm not trying to get distribution or like I don't have the rights to all this stuff. So it's just out there for the cultural and educational purposes, but it'll premiere on the NYC Rocks TV YouTube channel, Saturday, June 28th at 2:00 p.m. New York time. Cause I'm here in Germany. So that'll be 8:00 here. And you can go NYC Rocks TV YouTube channel, or there's a website, www.nycrocks.tv, and that will also have the URL. I will post it on the, probably the day before. So, I'll share it on my social media. It should be on the website so people can, mark it, save it if they want to check it out live. And then after that, it'll live on that channel, the NYC Rocks TV channel on YouTube. And the part one covers 1980 to 89. And part 2 covers 93 until 2025. So that will air 2 weeks later. So that'll be Saturday, July 12th, same time, 2:00. same channel. And again, we'll have a live chat, see who shows up, if that's any good. And then, I figure I'd give 2 weeks between the two just to let the first one settle in, maybe to get people interested. Most people, that's what the story that they know of John Sykes. But part 2, I think, is equally as interesting. And there's a lot of new information there and new music from John that you probably don't know, even if you're a John Sykes fan. And it's extension of the story, and there's more footage of John from that time period. So I think both parts are equally engaging if you're into hard rock, if you know something about John and you just want to learn more about him and revisit his music and his career. I think these films will be, the go-to for that.
Yeah. Well, Damian, best of luck with it. You did a great job with it. Look forward to watching it again this time. So once again, for more information on the rockumentary, John Sykes, his own words, his music, head over to YouTube at New York City Rocks TV for all of the details. So Damian, I appreciate your time today. So for my guest, Damian Kolodiy, I'm Metal Walt, and this is Metal Mayhem ROC.
Metal for life.
Thank you for listening to Metal Mayhem ROC. Check out our website at metalmayhemroc.com for information on podcasts, archives, links to all our live radio shows, and all sorts of info. Please follow, and share with everyone, even your non-metal friends. And always remember to keep it heavy.